Hello, and thank you for joining us. My guest today is the one and only Mahyar Tousi. Mahyar, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you.
Good. Mahyar, before we get going, I just wanted to flag up to some of our viewers who might or might not know. You were unwell. I know you don't mind me mentioning this. You were unwell, and you were taken to hospital last week. Are you okay? Are you on the mend?
Yeah. Last week I had a bit of a random, sort of like a panic attack sort of thing, and obviously they did more tests, and they said I seem to be fine. They said it's just probably stress related. I blame Boris Johnson. So.
Well, it's good to see that you're back on form. I was sorry to hear that you weren't well, but good to have you back, and I hope you have a speedy recovery. What I really wanted to do was spend a bit of time with you as someone who loves liberty, as someone, you were brought up in Iran under the tyrants there. You have a real appreciation of what it means to live in a free country. I just wanted to do a review of current affairs in the UK and America and around the world from the point of view of someone who loves liberty. So what do you think? What do you think some of the big issues have been over the past week? As a liberty lover, should we be optimistic or pessimistic?
I mean, over the last few weeks and months, it's been quite difficult with not just the government measures, with the lockdown and everything, but also the way the left have been advancing essentially in media and academia, in every area that you could think of. But the last few days, last week, we've had some good news. We've had new political parties starting. We've had a new TV channel. We've had potentially Charles Moore becoming the chairman of the BBC, and Paul Dacre, the head of Ofcom. So it's a bit of a mix and match.
Bag. Well, we'll talk a little bit about some of the changes to public broadcasting in just a minute. But one thing that really disturbed me was news about a peaceful protest in Trafalgar Square being broken up. Now, were you a witness to that? Did you go along and watch this protest being broken up by the police? What happened?
Yes. So I decided that morning to actually go there to report for my YouTube channel, because I had the feeling that the mainstream media won't be around, and they weren't really. The media were waiting for them to get their news from Twitter, if, for example, there are clashes or anything, so they could say that protesters have been attacking the police. I was there from like early on, and it was definitely peaceful. We were just standing around listening.
How many people? 10,000?
I wouldn't know, but it was definitely busier than the last couple of weeks, because when these regular rallies started, it was just in the middle of the actual square, Trafalgar Square, but now it's just around it as well.
Can you give us a feeling of what it's like being in the protest? I mean, are these kind of ordinary people? Are they angry people? Are they dangerous people? What kind of people are they? I mean, they're in American terms, you would say they're expressing their First Amendment rights. They're protesting peacefully. But what does it feel like to be in and amongst them as a group?
It was interesting because obviously, as a right winger, I don't protest unless you have to. So obviously, as long as we have a democratic system, you don't protest. But it was interesting. It was a coalition of different groups. You had obviously libertarians. You had some of the really hardcore lefties. You had BLM. You had environmentalists, and you had some ordinary people who are not even political. That was the majority.
Okay.
Yeah, that was the majority. Just ordinary people, just like standing around, just listening to speeches, because it was a rally essentially. It wasn't really a protest to kind of start chanting weird things, or and then you had obviously a tiny minority of rogue people who were like saying certain things.
I've addressed rallies in Trafalgar Square. I did it when I was an MP. I remember speaking at a demonstration in support of Israel at one time. I've spoken at various rallies in Trafalgar Square. It's a long tradition that you go there and you hear different speakers, and provided it's peaceful. It's probably the one place in central London where it's kind of difficult to obstruct anyone, because it's a big square. There's no traffic coming through it, and it was broken up by the police. Now, a lot of people have been quite annoyed by this, because they argue that while the police were, and the mayor of London, Calamity Khan, was very keen to tweet out unequivocally criticising the protesters, and the police were keen to break up the demonstration. There have been other previous demonstrations in there where actually the police have turned a blind eye and people have accused them of political favoritism. Do you think there's any substance in that?
Yeah, it was quite visible and obvious. I saw David Icke was speaking, and then when he finished, there was this German doctor who was going to speak out with some evidence that he had against the government policies, well, globally in general. And then the police randomly, because until then they were just like standing around, and then they decided to like get together, essentially try to kettle the crowd in the square, and it was quite random. It was like I don't know why they decided to do that then, but
You felt it was kind of arbitrary, yeah.
Yeah, some people obviously were. A lot of people just walked away. There were some people, the hardcore people, who were just like shouting at the police. To be fair, I did film it on YouTube, so the sort of things they were saying was that we are peaceful, we are on your side. Why are you doing this to us? Your job is supposed to keep peace, blah blah blah. And you know, a couple of people were just shouting at the police, but that was it. Like they didn't really try to get physical. The police started to push around some people when they were in their faces, but it could have gone worse. Some people got injured, but you know, it was unnecessary. When you, as you said, when you had like BLM riots, and when you had other protesters, Extinction Rebellion coming out, and then the mayor of London actually supporting it publicly, saying, "Oh, this is a good cause." And then you know, when you have ordinary people who are not even political, they just come out to exercise their rights and their freedom to say something. And I don't understand why the double standards exist.
Yeah. We've also had the rule of six introduced. This is a rule that says you're not allowed to hang out in groups of more than 6 people. And it's also been accompanied by a new directive which says restaurants and bars have to close at 10 p.m. Now, some people have pointed out that only a month ago, the government was using taxpayer money to subsidize restaurant meals to encourage us to go out. And a month later, they are trying to restrict people when it comes to going out. How do you think this has impacted younger people?
Well, firstly, restaurants and bars, except for the House of Parliament, because they are exempt. So that's fun.
But this is extraordinary. It's come to light that the one group of bars in the whole country that have been exempt from this rule are the politicians' bars in the House of Commons. I mean, you couldn't make it up. It's crazy.
I know, yeah. It's interesting because, for example, the rule of 6 was ridiculous because they had the cabinet meeting. They decided to come up with random numbers. They said, let's vote on 8. And then let's vote on 6. And it was close. And they were like, let's just go with 6. Where is the evidence? Like, what's wrong with 7? But I mean, as a libertarian, I've been, I'm going to confess, I've been breaking the rules from day one by doing one thing. When I go out, when I wash my hands for 19 seconds, not 20. So just to break the rules, to make myself feel better. But it's ridiculous.
It's this idea that you could create a set of rules, whether it's saying it's got to be 6 people rather than 7 people, and or bars should shut at 10 p.m. rather than 10:15. It's creating these detailed sets of rules and applying them irrespective of people's circumstances that I think people find quite grating. I mean, I've heard of families where there are 6 members in the family and they can't go see Granny, they can't hang out with Granny and Grandpa. And it does. I play a lot of tennis, and we're fine tennis. You can have a great game of mixed doubles. But friends of mine who play 7-a-side football say they're having to make do without the goalie, and
again, unless you're playing for Premier League wearing a BLM badge and kneel, then you can. But it's ridiculous. The one thing I would say about the 10 p.m. curfew, I was out since Thursday to check at around 10 p.m. in central London. As expected, when you send everyone home at the same time, the streets were packed, the tube stations, train stations were all packed, and it's counterproductive.
So by forcing everyone to leave the bars and the restaurants at 10 p.m., they're actually forcing people to congregate in large numbers and crowding out the public transport. Whoever would have thought that there would be such a thing as unintended consequences from arbitrary government measures? Yeah,
it's silly.
Yeah. One thing that was a little disturbing. I mean, a lot of university students, people in their late teens, early 20s, have started their university term. And yet there's some disturbing reports that some of them are basically being detained within their halls of residence. Have you heard of cases like that?
Yeah, especially in Scotland. Basically, they have been kidnapped by Nicola Sturgeon. It's kind of weird because even with the restaurants and bars, young people, The report came out that it's around 3% potential infection rate compared to other places, and especially when it comes to children, there's hardly any risk. And the problem is, I'm more concerned about what's happening at schools than outside with adults, because you could say the older people are kind of lost cause anyway, like in terms of taking their liberty. They're kind of used to it. But children, if you start taking their liberty now, and if you try to brainwash them, if you try to kind of essentially impose tyranny with no evidence, then they could be damaged like for decades and decades. And, you know, some of them might become radicals.
Imagine that you are a young person going to university. You know, mum and dad may have to remortgage the house so you can afford the fees, or if not, you would certainly be borrowing vast amounts of money at high rates of interest that you're going to be paying back for years to come. Now, imagine if you're then starting your university career, you're not allowed out of your hall of residence, you're not allowed to socialize, you're not allowed to meet people. And to make it worse, you're then told that all of your learning is going to be done remotely. Now, a lot of people might think, hang on a second, what's the point of being at university? Why not go home and live at mum and dad's house in your old bedroom and save on the university fees? But the one organization that you might expect to champion the cause of students who are getting such a raw deal, the National Union of Students, far from actually campaigning on this, chose this week to make the week where they launched, guess what, drum roll, the campaign to decolonize the university curriculum.
It's funny. It reminds me of what the Liberal Democrats are doing, because they're having their conference apparently. They've decided, with all the stuff that's going on, whether it's the lockdown policies or Brexit or anything else, they are having a vote on pronouns, because that's a priority right now.
But hang on a second, Mahyar. If the Liberal Democrats have their conference, they'll be able to do that in person, because you need to have more than 6 people in order to socialise. And I don't think there are more than 6 Liberal Democrats left.
No, it doesn't apply to them, so they're fine. The conference is going full on. But it is funny. You're right. They for example, the NUS and these groups, they don't really represent students. They don't represent reality, and they're concerned about the idiotic political games, and it is just damaging students. And you know, we need to basically defund the NUS and just like get rid of it. There's no point.
So it's been a bad week for liberty, for peaceful protesters exercising what you might call their First Amendment rights, their freedoms to protest. It's been a bad week for people in terms of restrictive measures imposed, particularly for students. But actually, it's been a really good week for diversity of opinion. We've had in this country a long tradition of a state broadcaster, the BBC, imposing what you might call Guardian television, or if you were to talk to an American audience, you might say it was, you know, imagine the New York Times making television. That's been the BBC's output in this country for many years. But there's some good news on that front. What changes are afoot that mean we might actually begin to hear a diversity of opinion?
Yes, so we have 2 names, Charles Moore and Paul Dacre. Charles Moore, who was Margaret Thatcher's biographer, and Paul Dacre from the Daily Mail, who are both conservative-leaning and Brexiteer, and they are massive critics of the BBC and the whole concept of the British media. They are now potentially going to be heading the BBC and Ofcom. So obviously it's interesting, because it shouldn't come to this point where in order to tackle or counter the left, you have to have right-wingers. But unfortunately, you have to. This is the point that we have.
To put it in perspective, Charles Moore is not just a biographer of Thatcher and a former editor of the Daily Telegraph. He's a man who's actually been so outraged by some of the content of the BBC, he refused, under threat of going to prison, to pay the compulsory licence fee to subsidise leftist propaganda. And now Boris Johnson is nominating him to chair the BBC. Now, what I find really extraordinary about this and really encouraging is Charles Moore he might have his views about things, but the one thing he really understands, having edited a newspaper that had a real diversity of comment in its pages, is that you need real diversity. Diversity shouldn't just mean that, you know, you select people based on where their grandparents came from or their life story. Diversity means actually diversity of opinion, particularly for drama. and for documentary output. That, the BBC's, it's been a bit of a cartel for years, hasn't it? It's not really had a full spectrum of output and thought.
No, I mean, they have diversity of skin color and gender, but in reality, when you look at the way they're thinking and their views, they're all the same. They all talk the same. They all walk the same. They all come from the same kind of education backgrounds. And the problem is when you create echo chambers, you sit around in an office, you agree with all the views. Even if you try your best to be impartial because that's your job, because of the BBC charter and everything, naturally you can't. And that's why a lot of people I've spoken to who work in the BBC, they get surprised when I say this. They're like, why do you think we are like biased? We're trying our best. I'm like, because you don't even know you're doing it. It's so hard work. It's so second nature.
It's extraordinary how, if you look at BBC drama output, if anyone ever works for a big enterprise, they're inevitably a baddie. If anyone has ever made wealth by supplying lots of people with a product that they want, it's always because they somehow cheated the system. The way they always represent enterprise and the market is always inherently negative. And they always represent government action, government intervention as virtuous. So often in a script, in a drama script commissioned by the BBC, the hero will be the person who takes on the non-regulated protagonist, and the way that the tension in the drama is resolved is by some sort of government action. I mean, it's quite extraordinary how BBC drama attacks the notion of a free self-ordering society and a free self-ordering economy. You can almost spot from the outset who the murderer in the whodunit is going to be. They're almost always the well-off entrepreneur or the businessman or the businesswoman. It's quite extraordinary how woke BBC output is and how anti-free market BBC output is. So it'll be wonderful if we see a change to that. Now, the Minister for Culture, Media and Sport is a chap called Oliver Dowden, and he's done something rather interesting this week. What's that?
I'm guessing you're talking about the museums.
Yeah.
Because to be fair, even Gavin Williamson as Education Secretary last year, he warned against universities going against free speech. Now Oliver is going against museums who want to rewrite history, which is ironic because their job is supposed to protect it. And if they plan to remove a statue or change any kind of wording of anything, they've said that they could lose government support, and that's absolutely fine. Again, it's a shame that it has come to the point where we have to counter it in that sense. But if something is a state body and funded by the state, and then because if it's publicly funded, it has to be in the interest of the public, not a loud minority who are basically radical.
I know. I mean, I feel the same about this, rather the way I felt about Donald Trump's announcement in America that he was going to take some sort of federal initiative to ensure that young Americans were taught a truthful version and an honest version about America's founding and America's past, rather than the sort of 1619 woke agenda. On the one hand, I thought, central government initiative, Oliver Dowden issuing a decree to all the museums saying, you can't do this or you shouldn't do that. On the one hand, I'm instinctively concerned about that. Yeah. But I can't really see any other way of tackling this. If museums in this country that are in receipt of large amounts of public money are going to be run by a small left-wing radical clique who aren't accountable to anyone and who are going to impose a sort of an agenda to what you might call woke wash their collections, I do think the government has a duty to step in and until we maybe re-engineer the system of accountability, I can't see a different way of doing it. Can you?
No, under the current system, unfortunately, any big government problems need to be solved using big government, ironically, and unless you have a situation where, because for example, with museums, with a lot of other sectors, media, or even education, the best solution is to get them out of the state sector. Yeah. But we can't right now, and that's why we need to use the state to help. But hopefully we could get to a point, we've been saying it, people like on our side for decades and centuries, that you could have a sound kind of classical liberal libertarian leaning system. But you can't have it unless you have one brave person to become prime minister who would actually push. But again, that will be kind of short term. That will be 5 years, 10 years, and then they'll go away then again.
It seems to me as if without making a big announcement, Boris is putting in place what you might call a strategy to deal with this sort of anti-limited government, radical leftist agenda that's in our public institutions. He's not only beginning to make really important, significant appointments to make sure that people in positions of public authority share the limited government agenda that people voted for, but we start to see, I think, what looks to me like a strategic approach to education, extending school choice, and trying to make sure that various institutions of civic society are accountable to at least someone, rather than at the moment where they're the small leftist, radical leftist cliques are accountable only to other groups of radical leftists. So it does seem to me as if we're starting to see the beginnings of a strategy, and carefully crafted and thought through plan to address some of these issues.
Yeah, the Boris government is kind of interesting because it's always best to treat things like this objectively. So when they do something good, praise them; when not, criticize them. Because, for example, they're doing really well with Brexit, and they're doing really well with tackling media, but the lockdown policies have been quite crazy. I think you're right that they are trying their best to kind of shift the debate, especially when it comes to wokeness, without saying it. The reason they can't say it is because, again, the government is kind of like the Blair government, is run by opinion polls and focus groups, and the media pressure. So they know that the majority of the country, because of decades of indoctrination in terms of how we've been taught, are more collectivists, rather than if Boris Johnson come out and talks about liberty. The majority were like, why is he talking about liberty? We already have liberty.
Exactly.
Complacency. So he has to go with the kind of collectivist mentality of, the country and, all this stuff. But I think you're right that he is making certain moves without talking about it, whether it's the media or academia.
I mean, I think a key concept is going to be the idea of plurality. As someone who feels passionately about the free market, I wouldn't want, I'd love to draft a reading list that every kid in the country had to read so that they understood the free market. But I wouldn't want to force that on every classroom. What I would insist on is that if people are taught the ideas of, leftist thinkers, they should also be taught about Adam Smith. If people are taught about so-called market failure and the reason for government intervention to conserve the environment, for example, or to ensure that there are more equal outcomes in society, they also need to be exposed to the countervailing argument, which is that actually you don't need government intervention and you can get more equality through spontaneous order rather than government decree. So I think the key in all of this is not to impose one uniformity of ideas, but to insist, the government can rightfully insist that there's a plurality. If a teacher's going to tell you about one, Keynesian economics, you also need to hear about Austrian school economics, a plurality of opinion. I think that's something the government can legitimately insist on. And as a free marketeer, I don't think we should be too snooty about the government using its fiat to do that.
Yeah. And I think this has been the biggest issue with the education system in the West, because the teachers and the schools have been using, I'm guessing unintentionally at least, it's kind of biblical, essentially. They're treating life and with children as if everything's black and white, everything good and evil. So, but most things in life is not black and white. Things have pros and cons. So, for example, they treat capitalism and socialism as if one of them is black, one of them is white, one of them is good, one of them is evil, as opposed to both systems has flaws and also has some benefits. You're right. That's the best way to say it.
I've been reading Jonathan Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and it's absolutely fascinating on this point, how the education system encourages in America and Britain and other parts of the English-speaking world, it encourages young people to think of everything as a simplistic, almost sort of Manchian struggle between good and evil, And the good are those who are in favor of one set of solutions, and therefore if you don't agree with those solutions you must necessarily be bad. And that's a profoundly sort of illiberal outlook. And it's good to see the government finally beginning to put in place a strategy to address this.
It is. Go on.
Oh, you were on the verge.
I was just going to finish this because, as you said, beginning of the video, obviously my background is Persian. I was born in Iran, and a lot of things that's been happening recently is bringing back nostalgia in a bad way, flashbacks. As you said, like this whole good and evil mentality, black and white mentality. We were taught like that as kids in Iran. Everything has to be like this way or that way, and obviously we're right, the West is wrong, and everything that we're being taught here right now, even by the media, reminds me of how propaganda could spread so quickly and so badly. Again, I saw a photo of my good friend Steve Baker going into Parliament today wearing a 2020 is the 1980 is the new 1984 T-shirt. Like, yes, finally.
It's interesting you say that now, because both of us grew up in countries that were run by dictators. I grew up in Uganda in the 70s and the 80s. You grew up in Iran. I would say that probably Uganda is escaped that autocratic system. It's got quite a strong measure of democracy, not perfect, but a much stronger measure of democracy now. Iran, would you say Iran is more or less free now than it was when you were forced to flee?
It's interesting because obviously the measures, dictatorial measures, partly have gone worse. Some of them, they became slightly more loose because they realized, okay, that's a bit too much. But in reality, the people show that they're obeying, but deep inside, underneath, they're not. This is the whole problem with when the state tries to change culture, shift culture by behavior. Like in the West, we're doing it with like sugar tax and things like that. You can't. Firstly, it's immoral, but also it's wrong because you might get some people, even like tiny like majority, just about doing it. You cannot change everyone's behavior. And in Iran, it's getting worse because for example, they're more relaxed about music, or like women finally having chewing gum in public. But other things are getting worse, like free speech, free press, and it's a weird situation. And
the
again,
superficial relaxation, but the fundamentals are as autocratic as ever.
So
it's really interesting. I think it's partly because of being brought up in a country run by a dictator. I sometimes look at the freedom in this country, the freedom to stand in a public square in central London and say daft things. I mean, you mentioned a couple of speakers at the recent demonstration. I don't agree with a word those people say. But when you've been brought up in a country where you're not allowed to say what you think, it becomes personal. The idea that you should have the freedom to stand up and, be an idiot if you want to be an idiot. It's something that I think people who've always been brought up in Western democracies don't necessarily appreciate as much as they should.
Yeah, and I think sometimes I think maybe it has to go so far, like to the extreme side, for people to finally wake up. It's a cycle essentially.
I hope not.
I hope not.
London is a wonderful place to live. I love London, but I really think that it's people didn't build a wonderful city here that's one of the great financial centers of the world and one of the great cultural centers of the world because of the weather. They really didn't. Yeah. Not because it's basically a swamp in a damp, cold little island off the northwest coast of Europe. London is one of the great cities of the world because of freedom, economic and cultural and social freedom. It's liberty that built London. And, the whole world could be like London if you had freedom. I hope London doesn't lose sight of its own freedoms. So,
I don't know. Yeah. First you need to save London, then save the world.
Now, it's been wonderful to have you on. And I would love, you mentioned before we started recording, you would have space for me on your
Yes.
I'd love to. It would be one of the highlights of my month to appear on your YouTube channel. Keep up the fight for liberty, and thank you very much for taking the time to review the week with me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We
Thanks.
are the media.
Thanks. Bye.